In the last lecture, I explained that transcendentalism and the movement that it spawned is going to put a lot of people to thinking. It's going to get a lot of people to question the world that they see around them. I kind of hinted at the end of that lecture that one of the things that is going to cause people to question would be an institution that had really been an important part of American life from really the earliest of stages, and that would be, of course, slavery. You are going to see people that are going to begin to question this. They're going to begin to do this very, very openly. You're also going to see this movement that seeks to abolish the institution of slavery really give rise to other social movements as well. But before we go any further, guys, what I want to do is introduce you to the idea that gets this ball moving in the first place, and that would be a social movement that I will call abolitionism. The abolition movement is a movement within the United States, really begins to gain steam in the 1830s and 40s, and what it seeks to do is make the institution of slavery within the United States forever illegal. It wants to make it illegal to expand the institution of slavery. It wants to abolish the practice in the parts of the United States where it presently exists. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to see this emerge in three different ways. I'm going to give you three different modes of abolitionism here in this lecture. The first would be open rebellion. Open, raw, unapologetic violence in many cases that is used to overthrow the institution of slavery. We're going to talk about evangelical abolitionism, the idea that slavery was a sin as far as the Christian faith is concerned and needed to go away for that reason. And lastly, we're going to talk about what I consider to be the most effective form of abolitionism, and that would be political abolitionism. Use the powers of the government to abolish the institution of slavery. And as I said before, this is going to give rise to another social movement, and it's going to involve the equality of the sexes. So with all that being said, what I want to do is dig into this. The first place I want to talk about would be open rebellion. I want to talk to you about a guy from South Carolina, at least originally from South Carolina, a guy by the name of Denmark Vesey. Vesey is by trade, he's a sea captain. And the reason that it's important that you understand that is that A, he was a free person of color. We're not talking about a slave. And B, he traveled all up and down the Atlantic coast, including making stops in places like Philadelphia and Boston. Now, not only are those northern cities, they're also cities that were absolutely on fire when it comes to abolitionism, and a lot of very leading abolitionists. Denmark Vesey is going to put together what comes to be known as Vesey's conspiracy in 1822. We don't know all the finer details, but one of the things that we do know is that this encompassed thousands of people at its peak, and it was a conspiracy. It was a plan to lead a slave rebellion all the way across South Carolina. Now, obviously, the reason that it's called a conspiracy and not a rebellion, let alone a revolution, is because it doesn't succeed. At the 11th hour, one of his co-conspirators got cold feet and sold him out, and the authorities came, they arrested him, and they executed Denmark Vesey. But this really made a lot of people in South Carolina, which was a slave society if there ever was one, made them think long and critically hard about whether or not slavery at the end of the day was worth it. Another individual that I'd like you to know when it comes to open rebellion is a guy from Boston, another free person of color, a guy by the name of David Walker, who in 1829 is going to write this pamphlet that's entitled An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. In a lot of ways, Walker was ahead of his time in the sense that he understood that this whole issue of slavery wasn't unique to the United States. It was part of the bigger, broader concept that you might think of as colonialism, imperialism. That you don't get imperialism without slavery. And in a lot of ways, it was slavery that really allowed colonization to really be taken to the next level. Certainly, that was the case in the American experience. What David Walker ultimately said was, Um, there was any means that could be justified when it comes to overthrowing the system of slavery, including the use of violence. Somebody didn't like that all that much because shortly after this pamphlet is published, David Walker is assassinated in the city of Boston. So we've got people like Denmark Vesey that are planning big rebellions. You've got David Walker, who at least on the surface level seems to be encouraging open rebellion, but it's Nat Turner that actually leads an open rebellion. Unlike the other two names that I gave you, Turner is a slave by birth. He's also a very religiously convicted person. And in 1831, he's going to lead a rebellion that comes to bear his name. It comes to be known as Turner's Rebellion. This is going to begin in Northampton County. That would be in Virginia. Nat Turner um, has this religious vision. And it's a vision in which God comes to him and says, I want you to be my American Moses. I want you to set my people free. Now, naturally, Nat had a lot of questions. And one of the questions was, well, how do I know when it's time to go? Right? And apparently God just said, listen, Nat, you're just going to know. It just so happened that there was an eclipse that year. And he's looking up at the sky and he says, that has got to be my message. That's got to be my signal. And at that point, he and his fellows go ahead and they assemble and they begin their rebellion right on their master's plantation. Now, keep in mind, guys, we're not talking about a very well coordinated, orchestrated event. This is a situation where they're using anything that's handy: shovels, pickaxes, farm tools. So, as you can imagine, it's not only going to be a very violent rebellion, it's going to be a very gory, very bloody one as well. Now, the reason it's called a rebellion and not a revolution is because it doesn't succeed. In a few short days, the rebellion is put down by the militia in Virginia. But what's even more important about the rebellion is the aftermath of it. And in the aftermath, it caused a lot of debate in Virginia, where slavery really originated, but certainly it was well past its economic prime. And it caused a lot of people to think very, very critically about whether it was worth it. Are we paying more to police it? Are these issues like Turner's Rebellion more trouble than they're worth, so to speak? There's one more form of open rebellion that I'd like you to be mindful of before we move on, and that would be the Underground Railroad. Now, for those of you that understand what I'm talking about, you'll know that it was neither underground nor was it a railroad. What the Underground Railroad was a series of passages, safe homes, and to some extent individuals that could pass slaves from the South, from a slave state, onto the free states of the North, or in certain instances to other countries all the same. Depending on where you lived in the South, places like Kentucky or even North Carolina, you'd want to get to Canada because it's closer to you. If you lived in a place like Louisiana, Arkansas, or eastern Texas, Mexico is the way to go. Now, what Canada and Mexico both have in common is that slavery is illegal in those countries, and that means that you're home free. What often gets lost in this conversation involving the Underground Railroad, however, would be the guides who led it. It's people like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, that were the heroines, the lady heroes of the Underground Railroad. You would want somebody that was knowing what they were looking at when they were seeing certain things. Something as simple as a lantern being on in a window could signal that this house is safe and this is a friendly home that can offer food, shelter, information. Um, as I'll talk about in another lecture down the road, knowing what you were looking at when it comes to some of these African American quilts was a really big important thing as well. It could tell you what you need to prepare for in your next leg of the trip. It could tell you places that you might want to avoid, or better yet, how you might best fit in, how you might blend in and not stand out and get caught. And so it's Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth that you would want to lead you on this Underground Railroad because they knew what they were doing. They had done it many times before. It's also a very good example of open rebellion. The next form of abolitionism that I want to talk about would be what I call evangelical abolitionism. As you might imagine, these are people that are evangelical Christians, and they see slavery as an affront to the Christian religion. It's a sin and needs to be abolished for the simple purpose as such. This is a moral crusade for these individuals. They oppose slavery on moral grounds. But there's something else I want you to understand about this. The 1830s and 40s is a time period where you have evangelical Christians that are deeply involved in the political system. And one of the institutions, perhaps even the institution that will involve them in politics, is going to be the institution of slavery. They are going to form the abolitionist movement, and they're going to create some of the more important institutions within that movement. I'll talk about them in a second. But similar to the 21st century, when evangelicals become not only a very important voting bloc within certain rooms, certain governmental circles, certain political circles, they take up causes. They take up causes that are important when it comes to not only politics but social and cultural issues as well. The leading voice for evangelical abolitionism is a printer from Boston. Those of you that are following along with us on the PowerPoint, you're looking at him right now. That is William Lloyd Garrison. It's important that you know that he's a printer because William Lloyd Garrison is going to publish perhaps the leading newspaper that railed against slavery in this period, and that would be entitled The Liberator. You might not think of it today, considering newspapers are all but dead, at least in their traditional paper format. But in the middle of the 19th century, print journalism, print media was absolute cutting edge technology. The printing press was a really big deal because it was probably the preeminent form of mass communication at the time. Think of it as the social media, if you will, at the time. This is something that you can be informed upon relatively quickly. And so if you're a printer, like Garrison's a printer, this is one really effective way of getting out the word. Other printers, other authors, people like Theodore Weld, it's not going to be a coincidence that they're using the institution of print to spread this word as well. But whether you're talking about Weld's The Bible Against Slavery or Garrison's The Liberator, it's important that you understand that what they're doing is they're telling the horrors, the terrible, terrible tragedies of slavery from the perspective of the slave. This really hadn't been seen before. This hadn't been done before, and it was very, very powerful when it comes to bringing new people into the movement. One of those new people is going to be a guy by the name of Frederick Douglass that we'll talk about here in a second. But for right now, I want to talk a little bit about political abolitionism. As I mentioned before, political abolitionism is going to be not only the most probably successful form of abolitionism, but what they're going to try to do is appeal to the powers of government to abolish the institution of slavery. We've talked about Henry David Thoreau, who could probably be described as an abolitionist, and he's also trying to use the power of government. He's actually trying to curtail the power of government, its ability to fight this war that he sees as an excuse for spreading slavery. But maybe an even better example is what you're looking at right there, a political poster for an institution that comes to be known as the Free Soil Party. And the whole purpose of the Free Soil Party is to pass policies, reforms, and legislation that keeps slavery out of those western territories of Kansas and Nebraska and some of the other territories that will ultimately conquer from Mexico in that war. That's a good example of political abolitionism, but an even better example would be our good friend, Frederick Douglass. If you've read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he is going to proclaim that slavery is an institution that victimizes everybody. It hurts everybody and would be better off if it went away. Everybody would be better off. You have to understand the brilliance of this argument. if he were to just go as a former slave in his own right, if he was just to go in front of the American people and damn slavery and damn slave owners and damn the people that look the other way when this horrible, terrible institution continued to exist, probably not going to win a lot of allies. But if he can convince everybody, including slave owners, that they'd be better off, people like non slave owning whites, that they would have more economic opportunity, not only is that going to create more allies in the political process, you can mobilize the political process. You can pass legislation that ultimately amends the Constitution and thereby makes the institution of slavery illegal. But similar to the groups that I was telling about just a minute ago, Douglas is going to become a card carrying member of the Free Soil Party. And that's going to be a decision that his friend, the guy that's really responsible for his literary career, or at least introducing him to movers and shakers within the world of publishing and print, that was William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison saw the Free Soil Party as basically a collection of racists. They didn't really care about abolishing slavery for the moral purposes. They just did not want Kansas, for instance, open to the institution of slavery, because the more and more territory that's open, the less and less opportunity working class white men are going to have. But Douglas, I think, had a very appropriate response. What do I care what my potential ally is in this fight for? The bottom line is pretty simple. If he doesn't like slavery, I like him. Anybody that's going to help me to overthrow that system is good in my book, considering that's what my goal is. That's what I'm here to do. One thing that I want to leave you with before we move in a different direction, I'm almost making this out as if abolitionists were everywhere. They were a very loud minority, a very vocal minority, but make no mistake about it, they were absolutely a minority. If I had to say, I'd say most people that were not slave owners just simply wanted to look the other way when this institution was unfolding. Um, the people that openly defended slavery, people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, these are individuals that are going to have, just simply put, they're going to have a lot more money than the abolitionists are. They're going to have a lot more political power. Good example as to what I'm talking about is the state of Georgia put a bounty on William Lloyd Garrison's head, over $1,000, which was an enormous amount of money back then, over $1,000 to bring him back alive to the state of Georgia, where he might be incited for treason for doing things like distributing copies of the Liberator. Anyway, yes, the abolitionists are very important, and yes, they're very loud, and yes, they're going to do a great job of getting the word out there with respect to how bad slavery is. And they're ultimately going to play a very important role in the downfall of slavery. But understand two things before we transition. One, they're a very small minority, and two, they're up against a massive, massive political interest group. I mean, there might not be a bigger political interest group really maybe ever than the institution of slavery. There's so very much money involved in it. As I promised at the beginning of this lecture, one of the things that abolitionism is going to do is it's going to connect with another budding social movement, and that would be the movement for women's rights. The reason being, guys, is that some of the hardest working, most dedicated, most diligent activists against slavery just so happen to be women. It was women that raised money for these organizations. It was women that distributed copies of the Liberator. It was women that did a lot of the organizational grunt work that was so important with respect to the abolition movement. And then a light bulb kind of goes off in a lot of their minds. You know, here we are working our hearts and souls out for the civil rights of some people. Who's out there working for my civil rights? We're talking about a time period where women can't vote, they can't hold office, they many cases they're not able to own property, they're not able to access any courts, they don't really have protection under the law. That's the great irony. That's the rub, if you will. And for people like Catherine Beecher, who you're looking at right there, this was another cause worth taking up. Catherine Beecher is really going to challenge this notion of separate spheres for men and women. This is ultimately going to come to be known as the cult of true womanhood. And what it espouses is that woman's natural place is in the home, keeping the home and raising children. People like Beecher are going to reject that. In the process, they're going to form an organization called the Female Moral Reform Society. And their whole mission in life is to end evils that especially afflict women. Prostitution is a very good example. At that particular moment, middle of the 19th century, prostitution was illegal for women, not so much for men. What Beecher wants, and she lobbies through the Female Moral Reform Society, is to criminalize the sexual promiscuity of men, to make solicitation of prostitution a crime, and in the process, criminalizing male sexuality. Now, for very obvious reasons, that's a controversial thing to do, but when pressed on the issue that this is politics, it's a man's world, and it's no place for a lady, Beecher turned that argument on its head. No, sir, I'm here trying to defend um, the rights of women, to defend the lives of women. I'm here to protect the home, sort of playing the cult of true womanhood against itself. Another good example of one of these early feminists that I'd like you to be mindful of would be a lady from Massachusetts by the name of Dorothy Dix. And similar to Beecher, she's going to do some things that do involve women integrating themselves into the public world, having criticism lobbied against them, and then pushing back against that criticism. In 1824, Dix is going to write this book called Conversations on Common Things. And she addresses a lot of things in this book, but one of the things that she presses for very, very forcefully is more public schooling. And not just more public schooling, but more public schooling for women and girls. That it was not okay just to allow boys to go to school and learn, but women ought to be included in this process as well. And similar to Beecher, she took a lot of criticism. This is not something that women ought to be doing. Proper women didn't do that sort of thing. And similar to Beecher, she pushed back and said, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to protect our homes by educating our girls and our women. She's largely successful. Not only is she successful in establishing more schools, but these schools are teaching more and more women. And in places like Massachusetts, you see the literacy rate amongst women continue to skyrocket. The last batch of activists that I'm going to tell you about, at least in the context of abolition women, would be Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Beecher Stowe. I like to think of Harriet Jacobs as the female version of Frederick Douglass in the sense that she was a slave that was successful in running away from slavery and actually lived to tell about it. When she runs away, she bumps into a collection of very radical women. I guess I'd say radical, certainly by the standards of the 19th century, maybe not so much today. In any case, she tells them her story. And these are women that have just gotten done, conducting what was called the Seneca Falls Conference. More of that in just a second. But they absolutely insisted that she needed to tell her story. Because the story that she's going to tell, her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is going to make the case that slavery was an institution that especially hurt women. Of course, it hurt men. You could see Frederick Douglass for that. But the way that men and women experienced slavery was different, and that was pointed out primarily by Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And ultimately, the case that she makes in there is slave girls are obviously victimized by the sexual promiscuity, the sexual harassment, the sexual assault even of their masters. But they were not the only women that were victimized. You have the case of the jealous mistress. You have white women that were victimized in this process as well, considering that their husbands were cheating. They knew they were cheating. They couldn't do very much about it for reasons that I've talked about earlier. You didn't really have access to courts. You had no access to power. There's not a lot of equal protection under the law. And so it's Jacobs that really kind of familiarizes the American public with the fact that men and women experienced slavery very, very different. And ultimately, it was an institution that hurt both white women and black women alike. Lady that you're looking at there on the screen is a female abolitionist by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who in the 1850s is going to write this really, really um, good selling book that's going to come to be known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. Many of you may be familiar with this book. It's not a very happy story, but it is going to become the primary book, the Bible, if you will, of the abolition movement. It's a fictional account, but it's based on fact and real life experience, and it tells the story of these slaves that are running away from their institution of slavery. And it's just harrowing story, terrible story after terrible story. And what it does is it brings in those fence sitters, those people that had desperately been trying to look away. If this is what slavery is, I can't look away any longer. As a matter of fact, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in the middle of the Civil War, and I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but he said, "So you're the little lady that started this whole war." The point being that it was such a massively influential piece of literature that it really galvanized support for the abolitionist movement in the North and against the institution of slavery throughout the South. You have the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah. We've talked about them to some extent in this class. They were anti-slavery lecturers that would eventually make this connection between um, chattel slavery experienced by people like Harriet Jacobs and what they called domestic slavery, the fact that they were living under the yoke and the oppression of their husbands. Now, as I said, this is all going to come to a head in 1848 when feminists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott are going to organize this conference that comes to be known as Seneca Falls in 1848. Upstate New York, you're going to have 70 women and 30 men that are going to sign this manifesto that comes to proclaim that we find these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. What Seneca Falls is going to outline, guys, is a civil rights platform for women. That's important and it should be in your notes. Seneca Falls is going to lead to a civil rights platform for women. It's going to repudiate this idea of separate spheres, separate roles to play for men and women. Women's role, of course, being in the domestic, while men make the decisions out in the public. But more than anything else, what Seneca Falls is going to lead to is what we call the suffrage movement. The movement to enfranchise women, to give them the right to vote. Now, they're not going to get that right until 1920, so 2 decades deep into the 20th century. But it was because of people like Susan B. Anthony that kept on insisting to vote, actually standing in line, and when she would get to the front of the line, the poll master would ask her what she planned on doing here, and when he said voting, or excuse me, when she said voting, he had her arrested. She kept getting arrested, but ultimately this is going to be proving to be successful in the sense that by 1920, Congress will enfranchise 51% of the population, and America will drag its knuckles into the 20th century. In any case, guys, I'm hopeful that you can see how these three things are connected. Transcendentalism makes a lot of people think about the world around them. Some of these people are abolitionists that begin to speak out very publicly about the institution of slavery. The abolition movement is going to give rise to the feminist movement because, once again, it's going to cause a lot of people to think very critically about their experiences within the abolitionist movement. And so it's interesting how these three things bleed into each other, but there again, it's also going to involve this continuing conversation that we're having. I told you at the time that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, I don't think he really understood the kind of can of worms that he was opening up, that there would be other dispossessed groups, in this case American women, that would come along and apply the concept of all men, and they meant mankind, we're created equal, this applies to me as well. And so, as I said way back then, this is a very evolutionary process, and we're seeing that kind of take hold in the late 1840s. When I return to you, we're going to talk about the reinvention of slavery. And when we talk about the Cotton Revolution, you're going to have a very good understanding as to how and why slavery is going to survive, even though leading figures within American life had predicted its downfall. More of that the next time we meet. For right now, thank you, and I'll see you later.